Brant is going to make an absolute joke out of the enemies, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to build and play him best, starting with how his kit works. Similarly to the Thundah guide, I'm simply going to be discussing what is relevant towards Brant's gameplay, instead of talking about each and every ability specifically. Brant is a fusion sword character who focuses on building up his Forte bar through aerial attacks, and once it is full he uses his enhanced skill to nuke the enemy. And that honestly kind of perfectly describes everything you need to know about Brant's gameplay. Basically, all of your time is going to be spent using his aerial attacks, simply building up his Forte meter. Brant's Forte can be filled in a variety of ways, being his skills, his basic attacks, and his aerial attacks. But his aerial attacks are by far the most efficient at building up this Forte bar, and once it is full, you want to simply use his Forte skill to absolutely nuclear bomb the enemy. That's all you're really going to notice during gameplay, but there is a little more to it. The biggest thing to note being Brant's Resonance Liberation. His Resonance Liberation is very weak on the surface, only doing a little bit of damage, but it also grants Brant the Aflame and the My Moment effect. Aflame will allow Brant to double the amount of Forte he generates per attack, meaning you're able to get his anchor out a lot faster. And the My Moment effect will enhance a buff that is already passively active within Brant's kit. Brant, within his Forte circuit, will be able to convert energy regen into attack. This has a very high scaling, which means that energy regen is actually Brant's strongest stat that isn't crit. And the My Moment effect simply makes this ER into attack conversion a lot stronger. Not quite double, but almost there. This effect caps out at 280% energy regen, so you're almost never going to be overcapping on this. If you ever fall to the ground while playing Brant, you can use his Resonance skill to go back into the air, but you can also just jump, so the Resonance skill is mainly just kinda there to give you a little bit of extra concerto, assuming you're missing any. This brings us to Brant's intro skill and outro skill. His intro skill will simply attack the enemy, and also allow Brant to start on his second mid-air basic attack assuming he does not fall onto the ground. It's worded in a bit of a confusing way, but just know that whenever you start attacking, assuming you don't get knocked to the ground first, you will start on your second aerial attack, which is pretty good because the first one is, I'm gonna be honest, pretty slow. His intro skill will also generate a bit of Forte. The outro skill will enhance the next Resonator's fusion and resonance skill damage by 20% and 25% respectively. This makes Brant obviously a perfect character to use with fusion skill damage dealers like Chong-Li or Chixia, but it also makes him good with all other kinds of characters. For example, characters like Encore, Jinshi, Carlotta, and Thundah, who do primarily fusion or skill damage. You don't need the character to be fusion and skill in order for Brant to be good with them. Now to dive into Brant's inherent skills. The first one will allow Brant to get 20% extra healing bonus from his Forte, because he is actually capable of healing based on the amount of Forte he has generated. I didn't mention this earlier because you're really not going to notice it while playing him, but it is a thing that he does do. Brant's second inherent skill is a pretty good bit of quality of life with a little damage buff, giving Brant a little bit of interruption resistance while using his mid-air attacks, as well as gaining 15% fusion damage bonus. Obviously, this is pretty good, because a mid-air character often suffers from the problems of, if you get hit, you're gonna tumble to the ground, but thanks to this little bit of interruption resistance, Brant really won't have this issue. The 15% fusion damage bonus is always a bit of a nice buff. And now it is time that we discuss Brant's rotation. First I'll discuss his rotation as a sub-DPS and then as a main DPS. Brant's sub-DPS rotation is incredibly simple. First you're going to start off with his intro skill, followed by his Resonance Liberation. Then you're going to use his fully held second aerial attack and his third aerial attack. At this point you should have enough Forte, and then you use his Forte skill and his Echo, and then you swap out. If you don't have enough Forte, which is pretty possible considering he might miss some of his hits, you can just use the fourth aerial attack and maybe a skill if you need it, but this shouldn't add too much time to the rotation. Then for his main DPS rotation, you actually want to intro skill into him twice. After the first intro skill, simply use as many held basic attacks as you can to fill up your Forte to being almost full. This is to prepare his Forte bar for when he actually starts getting the buffs from either Sanhua or Lupa. If you're playing Brant Hypercarry with Lupa, you want to be able to quick swap between Lupa and Brant while he is doing this. This is in order to save a very large chunk of time, so you can still prepare Brant's Forte, while also setting up your Lupa buff while doing that. Once you are done with this string of attacks and your Forte is almost full, you swap back into your support, and then you do Brant's intro skill again. You want to finish off your Forte generation, and if you already have enough Forte, use your Forte skill here. After which you use your Liberation, followed by as many mid-air attacks as it takes to fully fill Brant's Forte. And once it is fully filled out, you're simply going to use his Anchor for a second time. At the end, you use his Echo skill, and then you're gonna swap out again. Now for his Forte level up priority. Most of his damage is actually coming from his Forte circuit, which is the big Anchor, so you want to level that up first. After which you want to level up his basic attacks. This is another huge chunk of Brant's damage, so you definitely do not want to ignore either of these. Next up, I guess you'd want to level up his Liberation, followed by his intro skill, but honestly, I don't really think you're going to notice either of these, to be honest. Their damage contribution is small enough to where leaving them at level 6 should be completely fine, but if you want to level them higher, feel free to. Now it is time to talk about Brant's weapon situation, starting with, of course, his signature weapon, the Unflickering Valor. It has a low base attack, but it compensates this by having an absolutely massive amount of energy regen, the highest on any weapon in the entire game. So yeah, you can tell this is made for Brant and his ER scaling. On the passive, you get 8% crit rate, and you get 24% basic attack damage bonus after using your Liberation, with an additional 24% whenever you do basic attack damage. This is obviously a perfect passive for Brant, because almost all of his damage counts as basic attacks, being both his mid-air attack as well as his Forte circuit's Anchor nuke. So this is by far Brant's strongest weapon option. Next up, there is the Red Spring. It is the generic 587 base attack with a crit rate substat and attack on the passive, as we have all come to expect nowadays. It will give basic attack damage bonus whenever you deal basic attack damage, so that is a pretty good passive for Brant, because as I said earlier, well, almost all of his damage is basic attacks, so it's no surprise that this is the second best in slot weapon. Then there is the Emerald of Genesis. This is good for very similar reasons that Red Spring is good, although the passive isn't as powerful. Instead of getting basic attack damage bonus, you get a little bit of attack percent whenever you use your skill. Additionally, you also get a little bit of ER, which Brant does appreciate, but it's honestly not that big of a deal. Then next up there is the Blood Pact Pledge, which is the free weapon from the version 2.2 storyline. It has a high base attack like the other weapons, but it kinda has an entirely useless passive. The reason this weapon is good is because it has an ER substat, and while it is not as much as the Unflickering Valor, it is enough to enable Tide-Breaking Courage, which is Brant's signature set. Then for other weapon options, there is the Blazing Brilliance and Overture, but these are worse than the literal free Blood Pact Pledge, so I wouldn't exactly advise running them on your Brant unless you straight up can't use Blood Pact Pledge for whatever reason. As you can see from this sheet, getting Brant's signature weapon will be an absolutely massive increase for his personal damage, so I recommend literally every single person who wants to get Brant to pick up this sword. Trust me, you are not going to regret getting it, and it's going to absolutely save your life. I really cannot emphasize just how important it is for people to grab up this sword. And this brings us to Brant's Echoes, and I'm gonna be honest with you, Brant's Echoes are a little bit peculiar. His best set, in theory, is the Tide-Breaking Courage. You get 10% ER on the 2-piece, as well as a little bit of attack on the 5-piece. But what's really important here is the 30% damage bonus, as long as your energy regen is above 250%. This is reachable with ER weapons like Overture, Blood Pact Pledge, and especially Unflickering Valor. But if you're not running an ER weapon, you're actually not capable of triggering this requirement. So it is a bit of a peculiar set, because unless you have an ER weapon, this set basically doesn't even have an effect. So only farm this set if you actually have an ER weapon to put on your Brant. The best echo to put on this set would be Dragon of Dirge. Then there is the Molten Rift, giving you 10% fusion damage bonus on the 2-piece, and an additional 30% after casting your Resonant skill. You do want to actually cast your Resonant skill before using Brant's intro skill, so you can actually benefit from this extra 30% fusion damage bonus, but it is only a little bit of a bother, and not that big of a deal. So obviously this is a good set for giving just generalist fusion damage bonus, and it also does not have a stat requirement like the Tidebreaking Courage. This is going to be the best set to run on your Brant, assuming you are running a crit weapon. The best primary echo to put on this set would be the regular Inferno Rider, but this does require precasting, so Nightmare Inferno Rider is also a fine alternative. Flaming Clawprint is also a set that you could put on your Brant, but you're sacrificing a lot of personal damage for this, which in my opinion isn't worth it. Brant's personal damage is some of the highest for any sub-DPS, so honestly, I would stick to Molten Rift or Tidebreaking Courage assuming you have an ER weapon. As for your main stats, on your 4 cost you want to run either crit rate or crit damage, but crit rate will usually perform better. On your 3 costs, you want to run ER. ER is going to be the best option here, unless you specifically have Unflickering Valor and a bunch of energy regen substats, because at that point you're going to overcap on his 280% ER requirement. When this happens, you're simply going to be running energy regen and fusion damage bonus. And then on your 1 cost, you're simply going to be running attack percent. For your substats, prioritize getting crit rolls followed by energy regen rolls. These are going to be the biggest increases to your Brant's damage. After this, get attack percent and basic attack damage bonus. Anything else is going to be okay, but not really that powerful. And this finally brings us to Brant's team selection, which oh boy is gonna be a bit of a doozy. His best in slot team is obviously in the triple fusion team, where he is getting buffed by Lupa and buffing Chong-Li. This team has a full rotation of synergy with every single character buffing the next one, with Brant taking the helm as the second character in the rotation, getting buffed by Lupa and to buff Chong-Li. His personal damage is ridiculously powerful in this team thanks to Lupa's universal fusion damage buffs, as well as her outro buffing Brant's fusion and basic attack damage, which is obviously, like I said earlier, almost all of Brant's damage output. This team just has perfect synergy with each other, and gets ridiculously powerful clears within Tower and Whimpering Wastes, so this is obviously the best team to put your Brant in, but far from the only one. Thanks to Brant's outro skill being so universally applicable, he is a very good sub-DPS in a number of teams. For example, he is actually one of the best buffers to pair with characters like Encore and Shishia like I said earlier. Encore is a fusion DPS, so she obviously gets the benefit from the fusion damage buffing, but she also uses a fair amount of resonance skills, which means she can also take advantage of that buff pretty well. Shishia also does a very large amount of skill damage, and because she is also a fusion character, she is also capable of benefiting from Brant's outro skill very well. When it comes to non-fusion characters, Brant is obviously very good with all the skill DPS characters, like Carlotta and Jinchi. With Jinchi, you are going to need to run Farina in your Brant and Jinchi team, because Jinchi wants to have coordinated attacks in order to fill up her Forte bar, but outside of this, Brant doesn't really have any challenges when it comes to Jinchi. His personal damage is simply so high that for any skill DPS, Brant will be a good option. This even includes characters who don't even do majorly skill damage, like Frolova, because while Frolova is on the field, most of her damage does count as skill damage. So while Brant's buffing will not be able to buff up Hecate since it doesn't even count as skill damage, it is still a pretty good option for your Frolova. That's it for most of Brant's sub-DPS teams, but Brant can also function as a main DPS, either going with Sonhua and Shorekeeper, or with Lupa and Shorekeeper. It is actually a pretty good team because Brant has some of the highest personal damage out of all sub-DPS characters. His Anchor does an absolutely disgusting amount of damage, and with the DPS rotation that I showed you earlier, you're able to get it buffed twice. So it is actually a pretty powerful DPS team. Lupa is the better option here because she has more buffing, but it also requires a little bit more effort because you're going to want to quick swap while Brant is building up his Forte and Lupa is also building up hers, so it does require a little bit more effort. It's not like the swaps require much brain power, because you're basically just gonna swap whenever the cooldown is not up, but it is still worth considering. Now it's finally time to talk about Brant's sequences. Brant's first sequence will make enemies stagnate whenever he uses his Forte skill, which is actually very useful to make sure that Brant doesn't straight up whiff most of his damage output. Additionally, after using Brant's intro skill or after finishing one of his mid-air attacks, Brant will gain 20% damage bonus for 5 seconds, which stacks up to 3 times. This is actually a very large damage increase, and one of the best S1s in the entire game. Especially if you want to be a Brant main DPS player, this is a pretty good pickup for your Brant. Brant's second sequence will give him 30% crit rate for his mid-air attacks or his Forte skill, and whenever Brant uses his outro skill, he gains an additional buff. Whenever the character that Brant used his outro skill on uses their resonance skill, Brant will do an additional tick of damage worth 440% of his attack, and this deals basic attack damage. This can trigger up to 2 times. This is actually also another pretty good sequence. It gives Brant more personal damage whenever you're running characters that have multiple resonance skills, for example like Chongli and Encore who use it multiple times per rotation. But even with characters that don't use multiple resonance skills per rotation, it's still a pretty good effect, especially when you combine together the fact that you're getting 30% crit rate on most of Brant's damage output. Yet another incredible sequence. Brant's third sequence increases the damage multiplier of his Forte skill by 42%. Like I said earlier, this is most of Brant's damage output, so this is also another pretty good sequence, despite being a pretty simple one to understand. So Brant's sequence 1 through 3 are all pretty powerful. Brant's fourth sequence will simply make the shield from his Forte skill stronger, as well as giving more healing whenever you cast his Forte skill. This is honestly pretty useless in my opinion, because you're not using Brant in your team because he keeps you alive. You're using him for his damage output and for his buffing. So I don't think this is that good of a sequence. For his fifth sequence, Brant will gain 15% basic attack damage bonus when doing basic attack damage. This is a really mediocre damage upgrade. It's still better than the S4, but this is just a road to S6 sequence. Speaking of S6, Brant's mid-air attacks will have their multiplier increased by an additional 30%, making them stronger by a pretty large chunk. And additionally, whenever Brant casts his Forte skill, he will do an additional blast of damage worth 30% of the original hit's damage. It's a bit lame in my opinion that they didn't dare increase the damage multiplier again, but effectively you're still getting 30% more damage out of your Forte skill. And because, like I've said plenty of times at this point, his Forte skill is most of his damage, this is yet another really powerful sequence. It's essentially just a 30% damage increase to all of Brant's relevant damage output. And that is going to be it for my Brant guide. If you learned anything, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions, be sure to comment down below, but a better place to reach me would be through my Discord server, which is linked in the description. If you just want to see more of me as a person, you can also check the link in the description to check out my second channel. I kinda just post whatever I want there, but primarily punishing Grey Raven. But that'll be all from me. Peace.